theory. Okay, so what is utilitarianism? Utilitarianism teaches us that a course of action is morally right. It hypothesizes that a course of action is morally right when it tends to maximize happiness, pleasure, or preference satisfaction for the greatest number of affected individuals. Some utilitarian thinkers, classical utilitarianism is strictly anthropocentric. Again, the assumption going in is that we're talking about human individuals here. Peter Singer, I just want to point that out real quickly. Peter Singer identifies as a utilitarian, and he's probably the most influential animal rights or animal liberation activist out there. He's been working since the 1970s in the philosophy of animal liberation. And he identifies as a utilitarian. He makes the very cogent point that if pain and pleasure are the basis of your moral determination, right? Maximize pain. Does the action maximize pain? If the answer is yes, then it's a bad action, right? Does the answer maximize pleasure? Is there more pleasure than pain? Well, then it's a good action, right? But humans aren't the only ones that feel pain and pleasure. And so if you're going to use pain and pleasure as the kind of the fulcrum on which to decide whether an action is right or wrong, then you probably ought to include non-human animals in your moral calculus, right? So utilitarianism kind of starts, with the idea that all beings strive toward happiness. And that's certainly true for non-human beings as well as human beings. So all those non-human beings that clearly feel pain and pleasure, happiness and sadness, probably ought to be included in our moral calculus, and that might well be a very strong argument to be vegetarian. Right? And that's what Peter Singer says. He says, look, if you weigh the pains and pleasures, this animal that I'm eating gives up his whole life, right? Gives up everything. Whereas if I was to not eat that animal, the only thing I would be giving up would be some sensation in my taste buds that I find pleasurable. And maybe some nutritional value which I can work around if I learn how to eat right, without any meat. Anyway, so from a utilitarian point of view, weighing the general overall happiness versus the general overall sadness among all affected sentient beings, seems like a choice to be vegetarian. It's almost a no-brainer. Maybe. Anyway, I threw out some challenging ideas, but I hope to be challenged when I throw out challenging ideas. All right. A course of action is morally right. So now utilitarianism, though, needs to be always distinguished from what someone like Leopold is doing. Leopold is not, and cannot possibly be identified as a utilitarian because Leopold is a holist. And whole collections of things, Leopold's primary unit of moral concern is the biotic community. And there's dispute about whether or not he includes, whether or not he means all human and non-human, but anyway, we'll get to that when the time comes. But the biotic community. Leopold's famous maxim, the principle which he believes land managers should use when they make management decisions. A thing is right, a land management decision is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise, okay? So, does the biotic community feel pain and pleasure, happiness and sadness? Does it have a neurological apparatus to feel such a thing? The community. Yes or no? No. So, if your primary unit of moral concern is the community, you cannot be a utilitarian because there is no there to be experiencing pain and pleasure, okay? So, right off the bat, Leopold is not a utilitarian, but he is still a consequentialist, right? A course of action is morally right when it tends to preserve the integrity and stability, and he says, and beauty of the biotic community, all right? And that's a consequence, right? You either preserve it or you don't. And the test of the morality of the action, the moral rightness or wrongness, right? The test, the normative test, is whether or not you achieve a certain consequence, namely protection, preservation of the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. So I identify Leopold as a holistic consequentialist. And then I proceed to remind people that utilitarianism is an individualistic form of consequentialism. All right? But because Leopold's ethic is holistic, he cannot be identified as a utilitarian. All right? Okay, so that's enough of that. So utilitarianism, a theory of normative ethics which holds an ethically correct course of action in any given situation, is the one which maximizes utility. This is what I want you to learn today. I want you to learn and utilitarianism is so easy. That's why we start with utilitarianism. It's really remarkably easy. People think going into philosophy, oh man, this is going to be hard. I must not be understanding it because it's too obvious to me, right? Well, you do understand it, and it is obvious, and it's really, really easy. And most of us are dyed-in-the-wool habitual utilitarians. That's where we go. When we ask about the rightness or wrongness of a certain course of action, we tend to think about the consequences that will result from the action. And we tend to think about who is affected and how they're going to be affected. And we tend to conclude that if a bunch of people are going to be adversely affected, then, well, we better not do it, right? Okay. So we're all kind of habitual. Utilitarianism is the default mode of ethical reasoning in Western culture. And around the world at this point, really. All right, that's why I say in the second half of this page of notes. Consequentialist, forward-looking ethical reasoning. Consequentialists are always forward-looking. Maximizing utility, right? That's the test. Does it maximize utility? If it does, yay, it's good, 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 right? If it doesn't, boo, it's bad, bad, right? Okay? It's a very simple test. Does it maximize happiness and minimize suffering? Does it maximize pleasure? These are just different ways of saying it, right? Right conduct, what's the right thing to do? Is determined with reference to the good of maximizing utility. What's the right thing to do? Easy. Answer. Answer, do the thing that maximizes utility. Okay? So knowledge of that which maximizes utility, knowledge of the good, precedes knowledge of the right. In fact, there is no concern with the right. And this is an important point, because when we get to criticism of utilitarianism, this is kind of where the critics tend to focus on what's wrong with utilitarianism. That's a moral theory. Utilitarianism is the default form of ethical reasoning in our society. Utilitarian precepts are commonly relied on by legislators when they make laws, by administrators when they make decisions like at PSU. Right? We want our administrators to be good utilitarians. Utilitarianism can be described as the science of morality. Very simple, very efficient. It offers a seemingly neutral and seemingly objective formula for calculating morality and immorality. Utilitarianism always relies on the results of empirical studies. Okay? The right course of action is always, necessarily, that course of action which demonstrably leads to the most felicitous conclusions, the greatest pleasure for the most people. All right, and that seems to be a fairly objective test, doesn't it? Although we need to be very suspicious of this. As in every philosophical school of thought, we need to be suspicious. All right. So there is this important distinction between act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism, and don't be confused or, please, this is very, very simple distinction. They both still, the act utilitarian and the rule utilitarian, both rely on an analysis of foreseeable, reasonably foreseeable consequences, okay? And they both insist that the action which produces the most utility or / happiness, preference, satisfaction is the morally right course of action. Okay, the only difference is that the act utilitarian focuses on a discrete action itself. Okay, whereas the rule utilitarian, rather than doing the analysis of the act itself, of the discrete act, the analysis is one step removed. The rule utilitarian analyzes the rule that governs the act. So an example that I offer up here for you is the example of a relationship of sexual prostitution. All right? Bill and Belinda, one of these two is, I guess Belinda is the prostitute, and Bill wants to hire her. If you're an act utilitarian, and you want an answer, you're an act utilitarian, Bill comes up to you and says, hey man, here's a scenario, I want to hire Belinda, and you know about this stuff, tell me if this is right or wrong, and I'll follow your advice. Okay? So if you're an act utilitarian, you're going to ask, okay, well, who's affected by this proposal? You're suggesting a contract to have a contract for sexual services, right? So who's affected by this? And Bill says, well, I'm keeping it secret, and Belinda's keeping it secret too. So nobody else knows about this. We're the only ones. We're the only ones that know about it, and we're the only ones who are going to be affected by it. And then you'll ask, well, okay, so what will the outcome be for you, Bill? They say, well, hey, I got to have an orgasm, and you know, she's really attractive, she's really cute, man, I'm going to have a great time. So that's good. And then, well, what's in it for Belinda? Oh, I'm going to give her, you know, $1,200 or something, you know, so, and she, you know, she has bills to pay, so it's good for her too, right? So an act utilitarian, and that's all the farther, right, you need to ask. If you're an act utilitarian, because your focus is on the act itself. If you're going to conclude, nothing wrong, go for it. I have a nice time, you know, I hope, you know. Anyway, but if you're a rule utilitarian, your focus is not going to be that act. Your focus is going to be on rules about prostitution, all right? And so at that point, you have to go do a bunch of empirical studies to find out. And it might be very difficult, and the results might be ambiguous. They probably are. But who knows, you know, whether a society that observes the rule prostitution is illegal is overall more happy? That's the thesis, right? If you want to object to prostitution and you want to be a rule utilitarian, then your thesis is going to be that societies which tolerate prostitution in general have higher rates of unhappiness. All right, that would be your argument. And if you're a pro, if you think that rules against prostitution are silly, and you're a rule utilitarian, then you're going to go do a bunch of research, you're going to come up with all kinds of research that suggests that there's no difference. You know, no difference at all. Whether the society, that's not a big deal. Anyway, right, you guys see how that works? Okay, so anyway, you should be able to, after this brief introduction to utilitarianism, you should be able to get a pretty good idea of what, because conservationism is rule utilitarianism applied to natural resource ethics. Okay, that's the key. That's what I'm getting at. Conservationism, which is our topic for today, conservationism is rule utilitarianism applied to natural resource management questions. All right, and just go over a couple of the two leading towering utilitarians in the history of philosophy is Jeremy Bentham, is writing at the peak of the Enlightenment, right, in the 18th century. He's writing at the peak of the Enlightenment. And just some quotes in there. The hedonic calculus, this is how it works, right? If you need a real simple explanation of how a utilitarian reaches her normative conclusions, right? Because that's what we're all after. How do we reach a normative conclusion? The utilitarian does it like this. How do we reach a normative conclusion about an action, right? That's morally wrong. That's a normative claim, right? That's morally right. That's another moral claim, right? Moral judgment. How do we get there, right? Without just relying on religion, right? That's off limits. We can't rely on religion's off limits, out of bounds. We can't do that, right? No, no. Only our reason is available to us. And our experience, of course, our feelings, our reason, our experience, etc., our relationships, these are all resources that guide us, that guide our moral compasses, right? Anyway, but this is how utilitarian works. This is what Bentham called the hedonic calculus. How to decide whether a particular proposed course of action is right or wrong. First, take all affected parties into account, right? Equally into account. That's just bedrock, right? Every affected human individual needs to be taken into account and included in the hedonic calculus, okay? And Peter Singer, as I mentioned, goes so far as to say that if it feels, as long as it feels, then it needs to be included in the hedonic calculus. Next, figure out the sum totals of happiness and unhappiness. Just write them down, right? You've got a happiness ledger and an unhappiness ledger that likely to result. You just have to rely on science, right? The best available science to do that. And science is never 100% right? So you're going to have to, right? There are going to be some difficult decisions that you have to make to figure out. But eventually, you'll have a list of happinesses and unhappinesses, and then you'll reach your conclusion. If the total happiness exceeds the total unhappiness, then the proposed course of action is morally wrong. Real simple, okay? So the conservationists, basically, their goal is to apply that hedonic calculus to the resolution of natural resource management questions. All right? That's what we keep going back to. My dream future is a future in which all of my students go on to work for the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management, all these other federal and state and local land management agencies, and you guys all put to work the things that you learn in this class. That would be my ideal future. So.
Is hedonic calculus only supposed to apply to act utilitarianism?
Is that what you learned in the previous class?
No.
Oh, by the way, I have an appendix.
It seems like it would be kind of difficult to make to choose hedonic calculus to actually evaluate
Actually,
utilitarianism.
Jeremy Bentham, one of his lifelong projects he had a hand in everything. Jeremy Bentham was a very active man, and he had a hand in politics and economics and economic theory, everything. Anyway, one of his projects that he worked on his whole life was an encyclopedia of laws, and it wasn't just an ordinary encyclopedia. It was a compendium of every law on the books in England during his time, which is a lot of laws. And then he would undertake to justify every law on the basis of his hedonic calculus. And he kept some of his work secret because the implications of some of his work he thought might be too disturbing to the general public. But of interest is the fact that when he came to the laws on the books in those days in England about non-heteronormative relationships, sexual relationships, like gay relationships, they called for draconian punishment of people who were caught involved in homoerotic relationships. And I mean, they were hanged, but they had to be proved. It's very rare that anyone was actually hanged, but it did happen from time to time. And anyway, when he came to these laws, he tried very hard to fit them into his hedonic calculus, and he never could do it. And so he concluded that these laws should be abolished. But he didn't publish that because he was worried that people would accuse him of, being degenerate.
So if he was using hedonic calculus to try to evaluate a system of laws, then it does also apply to utilitarianism.
Yeah, it's just much more abstract, isn't it? I mean, the chain, right, between the law and the overall happiness of the society, right? That's a very complicated.
Hard to be more quantitative.
Yeah, yes, exactly. It's very hard to, and you get crackpots from the Family Research Council or something coming up with all these bizarre empirical studies about how, marriage equality has all these nefarious consequences. I mean, it's a very humans are a very complicated subject. Human societies. It seems possible to reach scientific conclusions about all kinds of contradictory things, Anyway, but as we move along the history of utilitarianism, John Stuart Mill picks up on this. He's the great towering 19th century utilitarian, and his great innovation was to introduce qualitative considerations and distinctions into calculations of happiness. And so he pointed out, right, this is kind of a logical move, that some kinds of happiness are qualitatively superior to other kinds of happiness. And so he says, it is quite compatible with the principle of utility to recognize the fact that some kinds of pleasure are more desirable and more valuable than others. It would be absurd that the estimation of pleasure should be supposed to depend on quantity alone. Right? He has this famous quote, it is better to be a human being dissatisfied, right? A human being feeling sadness and dissatisfaction and pain maybe, than to be a pig who's 100% satisfied all the time, right? It's still better because the quality of our experience, of those few happy experiences that we do have is so much greater, and just the quality of our lives is so much better than that of a pig. Anyway. So, but you can see how things get very complicated. If we could just stick with quantitative act utilitarianism, that's real simple, cut and dry. But we start having to acknowledge, that first of all, rules have some effect on acts, and maybe rule utilitarianism is an abstraction that's necessary. And then once we introduce qualitative distinctions, then our heads just start spinning. Well, at this point, it becomes very difficult to reach a normative conclusion, perhaps. But the main criticism of utilitarianism is that it leads, strictly followed, it leads to perversions of justice. All right, I'll give you some examples, but because I want to get to, I want to get to conservationism. But perversions of justice in the name of the greater good. Violations of individual rights in the name of the greater good. Let's say that in an example that's not even on this screen here, but so never mind this screen right here. Let's say that your neighbor is a very unpleasant man, but he has a lot of money in a metal box under his bed, and he has, let's say he has $50,000 under his bed, and he doesn't have any friends and he's dying. And before he dies, he makes you promise that you're going to send that $50,000 in the metal box under his bed to his nephew in Las Vegas. And you know that his nephew in Las Vegas is a drunkard, gambler. He's just going to blow the money probably in one night. That'll be the end of it, right? But your neighbor, you feel sorry for him. He's a very unpleasant person. He just has all these bad habits. Everyone hates him, right? And you don't really like him very much either. But you feel like you're his only friend. You're his only comfort. And so you promise him, and you look him in the eye, and you say, "Yes, I promise." And then he dies, right? What do you do? And then the day that he dies, you find out that the orphanage down the street, lo and behold, they need exactly $50,000, or all the kids are going to be thrown out on the street because they have to pay their bills, right? And they're way behind. So, is there anything morally wrong with you taking that $50,000 and giving it to the orphanage? How many people suspect that there may be something morally wrong with that? Nobody suspects that there may be something morally wrong with that? Okay. Breaking promises is immoral, regardless of the consequences that are produced by breaking those promises. In this case, let's say 200 children at the orphanage are going to get to keep their home, right? Whereas the only bad thing is this, then the nephew doesn't even know about it. That's part of it. The nephew does not know. You and the old man who just died are the only people who know about the existence of that money. The nephew does not know about it, okay? But still, you promised. So anyway, the point of this scenario is that there's something missing in the utilitarian analysis. If utilitarianism lends itself to the conclusion that breaking promises, heck, you could expand it. Torturing people, that's in that one example here. Torturing the child of a suspected terrorist to save a whole bunch of people. These things are all justified under a utilitarian analysis, right? So, it's not that utilitarianism is wrong. It offers us extremely valuable resources for negotiating our ways through all kinds of moral struggles, right? Through a lot of them. But it doesn't get us all the way on all of them, is the point. And there are defects, there are glaring gaps, right, in what utilitarianism can do for us. So perhaps we should be a little bit suspicious about the idea that this is it, that this is a final and conclusive account of what is going on when we engage in moral reasoning. All right? And I always suggest that you're all utilitarians, but you're all also deontologists or Kantians, and you're all also virtue ethicists, and you're all also sort of Leopoldian, holistic consequentialists. All right, there are elements of all these different kinds of arguments swarming around in your consciousness. And part of your everyday assignment in this class is to slow down your own moral reasoning process. Just try to figure out what's going on. When you catch yourself making a normative claim, just slow down and ask yourself, why? How did you get there? How did you reach that normative claim? All right. Another example, harvesting an elderly person's organs against her will. This is wrong under a Kantian analysis. Under a rule utilitarian analysis, it could be morally wrong, right? If empirical evidence suggests that maintaining and enforcing rules against involuntary organ harvest lead to greater overall happiness throughout society, right? But if there's no empirical evidence, to show that, then, yeah. But under a Kantian analysis, involuntary organ harvest is categorically wrong, period, no ifs, ands, or buts. All right? And our moral intuitions also suggest that it's wrong. Okay, now we'll get into what I was aiming toward this whole time. That's Gifford Pinchot. Pinchotian conservationism, or classical American conservationism, is rule utilitarianism applied to natural resource policy. This is a quote from something that you did not read from his other book, from his autobiography, I think. Conservationism is the foresighted, but it's a nice pithy encapsulation of his philosophy. The foresighted utilitization, preservation, and or renewal of forests, waters, lands, and minerals for the greatest good of the greatest number for the longest time. 3 variables then. It sounds great, and he was great at PR. Everyone just loved the guy. He gave all these press conferences, and he was a really good communicator. But philosophically, these variables are difficult to balance, and they're ill-defined. What is the greatest good? Come on, GIF. Are you just going to leave it at that? Oh, the greatest good. We're all supposed to know what that is. What is the greatest number? Does he mean just U.S. citizens? I suspect he did. When he was pushing this philosophy, he meant just U.S. citizens. But probably in a global society, it's got to include everyone on Earth. And what is the longest time? He's kind of indicating a value in sustainability. Can it be carried on, indefinitely? But what does that mean even, right? And you guys probably have taken studies on sustainability. I mean, some of you have taken courses on sustainability. It's not easy to pin down, right? We don't know what does that mean, sustainable, for the longest time? Anyway, and there it is, and there he is. So he is considered the father of the North American conservationist movement. Big, strong connection between Gifford Pinchot and Aldo Leopold. Okay? Gifford Pinchot is the nation's first forester. He's the founder of the Forest Service, oversaw the creation of the U.S. Forest Service under the Theodore Roosevelt administration in 1905, transferred administration of the nation's forests from the U.S. Department of the Interior to the U.S. Department of Agriculture. The U.S. Forest Service is in the Department of Agriculture, right? But this transfer is philosophically significant, right? You want to think about it at the time, but it's philosophically sophisticated because the Department of the Interior is what has the Park Service and the basically lands that are considered relatively natural, whereas the Department of Agriculture administers lands considered relatively cultural. So with one fell swoop, hundreds of millions of acres of land are transferred from a department that administers more or less wild lands to a department that administers farms, right? And so forests all of a sudden become tree farms, right? Pinchot was all about using natural resources for the greatest good. Believe it. I mean, he's got this national forest named after him, but I suspect if the forests themselves had had a vote, then they would not have elected his name to. All right, maybe. I mean, he made important contributions. I have an ambiguous, ambivalent relationship with old Giff, Uncle Giff. I like to think of them as my uncles, right? We got Uncle Giff, we got Uncle Aldo. He's my favorite uncle. You guys start thinking of Aldo Leopold as your uncle, and it'll make you feel good, make you feel warm inside. You think about visiting your Uncle Aldo. It smells like pipe smoke and leather, and he's always thinking about stuff and writing things down. It'd be fun to go fishing with him. Maybe go hunting. I don't go hunting though. So I don't go fishing anymore either. All right. So, all right. Let's see. So this is an interesting page of notes where I just point out that there are these remarkable parallels between rural utilitarianism as it was articulated, when Pinchot was forming his philosophy, and then Pinchot's philosophy himself. They're both their axiological orientations are the same: holistic, strongly anthropocentric. Yeah. So I would say this is the rule of conservationism. Okay. The most felicitous rule regarding natural resources: do this. Manage natural resources so as to ensure the long-term health of human communities and land, air, water, wildlife. All right, there's a famous photograph. The guy that looks like he slept in his clothes the last couple of weeks is the skinny guy. It's, of course, John Muir. And this is President Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt. And over here, the very well-dressed man is Uncle Giff. I don't know who the rest of them are. And they're standing in front of a sequoia tree in the western slope of the Sierra Nevada mountains. Of course, John Muir founded the Sierra Club, 1892, right? Kind of the golden age of North American environmentalism is, I would date from about 1890, the founding of the Sierra Club, for about 100 years. We made a lot of progress, and now we're doing something different, but there'll be a new wave of environmentalism coming up, or there already is. We're well into it. Anyway, the Sierra Club was founded for the express purpose of preserving and protecting and educating people about the beauty of the Sierra Nevada mountains. John Muir's spiritual home. John Muir was a beloved figure, very, very popular man, just beloved. Everyone loved him. He was a great storyteller, and he was a friend to everybody. People loved to hang out with him. Gifford, he was about 20 years older than Gifford Pinchot, but Pinchot would hang out with him as a young man, just loved him, loved to sit around the fire. They'd stay up all night. He would sit up listening to John Muir, listening to all the stories that he had to tell. But he hung out with the president, took the president up on, I'm not sure where that is, but you can see, it's in Yosemite somewhere. It's one of the famous places. So the one, by the way, this fight, I'm not sure when this photo was taken. It was probably taken while Teddy was president, and I think he was already out of office by 1909. So this was taken probably while they were still friends, around 1905 or 1906. But 1906, they had that great earthquake in San Francisco and a great fire. And one reason the fire was so bad was because the city of San Francisco had a very poor water system, very unreliable water supply, unreliable water system of distributing the water. So they lobbied Congress to build a O'Shaughnessy Dam, a giant dam, in Yosemite National Park. And that's what's the key part of this story, is that it's inside the park. Yosemite National Park at that time was just a few years old. I believe Yosemite National Park was created about 1902. So it's a very young national park, and it had two, nowadays we just think of the Yosemite Valley. But in those days they had the Yosemite Valley, and then they had the Hetch Hetchy Valley. And the Hetch Hetchy Valley was a little bit smaller, but it was the same types of features, just amazing glacially carved granite, all around, waterfalls coming down at various points across the rock, and then this just totally enchanted and magical valley floor, with some old growth forest down there, and lots of beautiful deer and wildlife and fish, and just a lovely place. And the city of San Francisco convinced Congress to provide the funding for the dam, and it was flooded. In 1922, I think the dam was finally made. But the battle was all going down between 1908 and 1913, and when John Muir found out that Gifford Pinchot, his buddy, was promoting this dam, he couldn't believe it. At first, he didn't think it was true, but later it was confirmed to him, and then they couldn't be friends anymore because it was such a sensitive, because this is John Muir's spiritual home in the Hetch Hetchy Valley. You can see why it was built, though, because if we were to make this map larger and see San Francisco, it's exactly due west of here. So all they have to do is build a dam, and then they don't even need pumps, right? They don't need anything. They just run a pipeline all the way to San Francisco. The cleanest, purest, best tasting water in the world, right? Still, it's been enjoyed now for almost 100 years by the people of San Francisco. But it destroyed the Hetch Hetchy Valley